The morning of June 12, 1993, dawned crisp and clear in Millbrook, Indiana, a town where everyone knew everyone else's business, and wedding bells were cause for celebration that could last for weeks. Elizabeth Hartwell stood before her bedroom mirror in her childhood home, adjusting the pearl necklace that had belonged to her grandmother. At 24, she possessed the kind of quiet beauty that turned heads without trying. Auburn hair that caught the light just so, green eyes that sparkled with an inner warmth, and a smile that could ease the worries of anyone fortunate enough to receive it. Her wedding dress, a simple but elegant creation of ivory, satin, and delicate lace, had been hanging in her closet for 3 months, waiting for this very day. Her mother, Dorothy, bustled about the room with nervous energy, straightening things that didn't need straightening and checking details that had already been confirmed a dozen times. The ceremony was scheduled for 2 o'clock at St. Matthew's Catholic Church, where Elizabeth had been baptized, confirmed, and where she'd met her fiancé, Robert Caldwell, during a church social 3 years prior. Robert worked at the local grain elevator and had saved every penny for 2 years to buy Elizabeth the modest but heartfelt engagement ring that now caught the morning sunlight streaming through her bedroom window. If you're enjoying this story and want to hear more mysterious disappearances that have haunted American communities for decades, please subscribe to our channel and let us know in the comments where you're watching from. We love connecting with viewers from all over the world. The Hartwell family had lived in Millbrook for 4 generations, running a small but successful hardware store on Main Street. Elizabeth's father, Frank, was known throughout the county as a man of his word, someone who'd give you the shirt off his back if you needed it. The family was deeply rooted in the community, active in church life, and Elizabeth's upcoming marriage to Robert had been the talk of the town for months. Everyone agreed they made a perfect couple, both kind-hearted, hard-working, and devoted to their faith and community. At 11:30 that morning, Elizabeth kissed her mother goodbye and said she needed to make one final stop before heading to the church to prepare with her bridesmaids. She told Dorothy she wanted to visit St. Matthew's alone for a few minutes of quiet prayer before the ceremony, a tradition she'd observed before every major milestone in her life. She drove her father's blue Ford pickup truck, the same one she'd learned to drive in, through the familiar streets of Millbrook, past the courthouse square with its century-old oak trees and the small businesses that formed the backbone of their community. Father Michael Donnelly had served St. Matthew's parish for 8 years by that June morning, arriving as a young priest fresh from seminary with idealistic dreams of shepherding a flock and making a meaningful difference in people's lives. The Irish-born cleric had quickly endeared himself to the congregation with his warm sermons and genuine interest in the personal struggles of his parishioners. At 35, he was considered by many to be the most eligible bachelor in 3 counties. If only he weren't bound by his vows of celibacy. His thick dark hair was beginning to show traces of premature silver, and his blue eyes held a depth that suggested he'd seen more of life's complexities than his relatively young age might indicate. The church itself was a beautiful stone structure built in 1887, with soaring Gothic arches, stained glass windows that cast rainbow patterns across the wooden pews, and a bell tower that could be heard for miles across the flat Indiana farmland. It was the spiritual center of Millbrook's Catholic community, and Father Donnelly took immense pride in maintaining both its physical beauty and its role as a sanctuary for those seeking comfort, guidance, and hope. Elizabeth's pickup truck was found that afternoon in the church parking lot, keys still in the ignition, her purse on the passenger seat with everything intact. Her wallet, driver's license, the small amount of cash she'd brought for any last-minute expenses, and a folded piece of paper with her handwritten wedding vows. The passenger door was slightly ajar, as if she'd gotten out quickly or been interrupted while gathering her belongings. Her wedding dress remained hanging in her childhood bedroom, waiting for a bride who would never return to claim it. When Elizabeth failed to arrive at the church by 1 o'clock for final preparations, her maid of honor, Janet Phillips, called the Hartwell house. Dorothy assumed her daughter was running late, perhaps having stopped to help someone in need. That would be just like Elizabeth. But as 1:30 approached and then 2 o'clock came and went, concern turned to panic. Robert stood at the altar in his rented tuxedo, his face growing paler by the minute as whispered conversations filled the church. The assembled guests, nearly 200 people from Millbrook and surrounding communities, waited in confused silence as Frank Hartwell and several other men began making phone calls and driving through town, searching for any sign of the missing bride. Father Donnelly attempted to calm the congregation, suggesting they pray for Elizabeth's safe return while the family and friends conducted their search. His voice carried its usual authority and warmth, but those who knew him well noticed a subtle tremor, a slight hesitation that seemed unusual for the typically composed priest. He assured everyone that there must be a simple explanation, that Elizabeth was probably dealing with some minor emergency and would arrive shortly with apologies and a perfectly reasonable story. By 4 o'clock, when the June sun was still high in the Indiana sky, but hope was beginning to fade, Frank Hartwell made the decision to contact the county sheriff's office. Sheriff Tom Bradley, a man who'd known Elizabeth since she was a little girl selling Girl Scout cookies door to door, arrived at St. Matthew's with 2 deputies and began what would become one of the most baffling missing persons cases in the county's history. The initial investigation was thorough, but yielded few concrete clues. Elizabeth's truck showed no signs of struggle, no fingerprints other than her own and her family members, and no indication of where she might have gone or why she would disappear on what should have been the happiest day of her life. The entire community rallied around the Hartwell family in the days and weeks that followed. Search parties combed the countryside. Volunteers distributed flyers with Elizabeth's photograph throughout Indiana and neighboring states, and the local newspaper ran front-page stories about the mysterious disappearance. Robert Caldwell was so distraught he could barely function, taking leave from his job at the grain elevator and spending his days driving aimlessly through rural roads, convinced he might spot Elizabeth walking along some forgotten highway, suffering from amnesia or some other condition that would explain her absence. Father Donnelly organized prayer vigils and offered counseling to the Hartwell family, visiting their home regularly and providing whatever comfort his faith and training could offer. He celebrated special masses for Elizabeth's safe return, and his sermons during those difficult summer months focused on themes of hope, faith in times of trial, and the mysterious ways in which God's plan sometimes unfolds. The priest seemed to take Elizabeth's disappearance particularly hard, often appearing tired and distracted, losing weight and spending long hours alone in the church, sometimes found by early morning parishioners kneeling before the altar in what appeared to be intense prayer or contemplation. The investigation continued for months, with leads that inevitably led nowhere. A truck driver thought he'd seen a young woman matching Elizabeth's description at a rest stop near Indianapolis, but the description was too vague to be useful. A family in Illinois reported a woman with auburn hair who'd briefly worked at their diner, but when investigators followed up, they found she was a runaway from Ohio with no connection to the case. The FBI was consulted, and agents spent several weeks in Millbrook, interviewing everyone who'd known Elizabeth, but federal involvement ended when no evidence of kidnapping or interstate crime could be established. As the first anniversary of Elizabeth's disappearance approached, the intensity of the search began to diminish, though the Hartwell family never stopped believing their daughter would return. Dorothy continued to set a place for Elizabeth at the dinner table every Sunday, and Frank kept her bedroom exactly as she'd left it, down to the wedding dress still hanging in the closet. Robert eventually returned to work, but never truly recovered from the loss, remaining single and becoming something of a recluse, politely declining the well-meaning attempts of friends and relatives to set him up with other eligible women in the county. The case grew cold as the years passed. Though Sheriff Bradley never officially closed the file, new deputies would occasionally review the evidence, hoping fresh eyes might notice something their predecessors had missed. But the mystery of Elizabeth Hartwell's disappearance remained unsolved. The story became part of Millbrook's local folklore, whispered about in the coffee shops and barber shops, a cautionary tale that reminded everyone how quickly life could change, and how even the most careful, faithful people could simply vanish without explanation. Father Donnelly continued to serve St. Matthew's parish through the 1990s and into the new millennium, becoming an integral part of the community's spiritual life. He officiated at hundreds of weddings, baptisms, and funerals, always carrying himself with the dignity and compassion that had made him beloved by his congregation. Yet those closest to him noticed subtle changes in the years following Elizabeth's disappearance, a tendency toward melancholy that hadn't been present in his earlier years, moments of distraction during services, and an increased interest in counseling parishioners dealing with guilt and the need for confession and forgiveness. The priest established several charitable programs in Elizabeth's memory, including a scholarship fund for young women pursuing education and a support group for families dealing with missing loved ones. He spoke regularly about the importance of cherishing every moment with those we love, since we never know when circumstances beyond our control might separate us from them. His homilies during this period were particularly moving, drawing on themes of loss, redemption, and the complex ways in which human love and divine love intersect in our lives. By 2008, 15 years had passed since Elizabeth's disappearance, and Millbrook had changed considerably. The town had grown from a small farming community to a suburban bedroom community for workers commuting to Indianapolis. Many of the old families had moved away or passed on, and newcomers who'd never heard of Elizabeth Hartwell filled the pews of St. Matthew's. The hardware store that Frank Hartwell had run for decades had been sold to a regional chain, and Dorothy Hartwell had died 3 years earlier, never learning what had happened to her daughter. Frank continued to live in the family home, now in his 70s, and struggling with the early stages of dementia. The house had become a monument to Elizabeth's memory, filled with photographs and mementos from her life, her wedding dress still hanging in the closet like a ghost of dreams that would never be realized. Robert Caldwell had moved to Indianapolis, though he returned to Millbrook every year on June 12th to place flowers at the memorial tree that had been planted in Elizabeth's honor in the courthouse square. Father Donnelly, now 50, remained at St. Matthew's, though his hair had gone completely grey, and the lines around his eyes spoke of years of carrying burdens that went beyond the normal responsibilities of parish life. He had trained several younger priests over the years, but none had stayed permanently, leaving him as the constant spiritual presence in a community that continued to change around him. Those who had known him longest noticed that he seemed increasingly burdened by something, spending more time in solitary prayer and often appearing lost in thought during conversations with parishioners. The priest had developed a reputation as someone particularly skilled at helping people work through guilt and shame, drawing on his own experiences with the complexities of human nature and the sometimes painful path toward redemption. He'd helped numerous couples reconcile after affairs, guided teenagers through crises of faith and identity, and counseled adults struggling with addiction and other life-altering problems. Yet despite his effectiveness in helping others find peace, those closest to him could see that Father Donnelly himself seemed to be wrestling with demons that his faith and training couldn't entirely quiet. During the spring of 2008, Father Donnelly's health began to decline noticeably. He developed a persistent cough that he couldn't shake, lost weight despite Dorothy's former replacement as church secretary constantly encouraging him to eat more, and seemed to have difficulty sleeping. Parish members would sometimes find him in the church at all hours of the night, kneeling before the altar or walking slowly through the empty pews as if searching for something he'd lost long ago. Dr. Patricia Wells, the physician who'd replaced the retiring doctor. Harrison, as Millbrook's primary medical provider, insisted that Father Donnelly undergo a complete physical examination. The results were sobering. He was suffering from early-stage lung cancer, despite never having smoked a cigarette in his life. The diagnosis came as a shock to the entire parish, and prayers for their beloved priest's recovery became a regular part of every service. Father Donnelly accepted the news with the same quiet dignity he brought to everything else, refusing to burden his congregation with his fears and continuing to perform his duties with the dedication that had characterized his entire ministry. As his condition worsened through the summer of 2008, Father Donnelly began to speak more frequently about the importance of confession and the peace that comes from acknowledging our failings before God and our fellow human beings. His sermons took on an urgency that hadn't been present in his earlier work, focusing on themes of truth-telling, the weight of secrets, and the possibility of redemption, even for those who had committed seemingly unforgivable acts. Regular parishioners noticed that he seemed to be working towards some kind of personal resolution, though none could have predicted what form it would take. The confession came on a humid Tuesday evening in late August 2008, 15 years and 2 months after Elizabeth Hartwell had disappeared. Father Donnelly had asked Frank Hartwell to meet him at St. Matthew's, claiming he had something important to discuss about Elizabeth's case. Frank, whose memory had been failing but whose love for his daughter remained constant, arrived at the church just after sunset, shuffling slowly up the steps he'd climbed countless times over the decades. Father Donnelly was waiting in his office, a small room behind the altar where he'd counseled thousands of parishioners over the years. The walls were lined with theological books, photographs of former parish events, and a simple wooden crucifix that had belonged to his predecessor. Frank noticed immediately that the priest looked terrible, thinner than he'd ever seen him, his face gaunt, and his eyes holding a pain that went beyond physical suffering. "Frank," Father Donnelly began, his voice barely above a whisper, "I need to tell you something about Elizabeth, something I should have told you 15 years ago." The old man leaned forward in his chair, suddenly more alert than he'd been in months. "What about Elizabeth? Did you remember something? Did someone tell you something?" Father Donnelly closed his eyes and took a shaking breath. When he opened them again, Frank saw tears streaming down the priest's face. "She came to see me that morning, just like her mother said. She came for prayer before the wedding." He paused, struggling to continue. "But she also came to tell me something that changed everything." Frank's heart began to race, though he remained silent, sensing that interrupting the priest now might prevent him from learning the truth he'd been seeking for 15 years. "She told me she was pregnant," Father Donnelly continued, his voice growing stronger with the relief of finally speaking words he'd held inside for so long. 3 months pregnant. She'd just found out the week before, and she was terrified. Not of having a child, she wanted children desperately, but of the timing. She was afraid Robert would think she'd deceived him, that their love wasn't real, that she was somehow forcing him into marriage. The revelation hit Frank like a physical blow. His daughter had been carrying his grandchild when she disappeared, a grandchild he'd never known existed. But why didn't she just tell us? Why didn't she tell Robert? He loved her. We all did. A baby would have been a blessing. Father Donnelly nodded, wiping his eyes with a handkerchief. "I told her the same thing. I spent nearly an hour with her that morning, trying to convince her that her family and Robert would support her, that there was nothing to be ashamed of. But Elizabeth was convinced that everyone would think differently of her, that the pregnancy would overshadow their marriage and make people question her moral character. She was always too hard on herself," Frank said quietly, memories of his daughter's perfectionist tendencies flooding back. But this still doesn't explain what happened to her. Did she run away because she was scared? Is she alive somewhere? The priest's composure crumbled completely then, and Frank watched in growing alarm as Father Donnelly buried his face in his hands and began to sob. "Frank, I'm so sorry. I am sorrier than you can ever know. I failed her. I failed you. I failed God." "What are you saying, Father? What happened?" After we talked, Elizabeth seemed calmer. She said she was going to go through with the wedding and tell Robert about the baby during their honeymoon. She was going to trust that love would overcome fear. She hugged me and thanked me for listening, for helping her see clearly. Father Donnelly's voice dropped to barely audible levels. But as she was leaving, something happened. Something I've regretted every day for 15 years. Frank leaned forward, his hands gripping the arms of his chair. "What happened?" "I kissed her." The words came out like a physical wound being opened. She was so beautiful, so vulnerable, and I had been fighting my feelings for her for years. When she hugged me, I lost control of myself. I kissed her, and I told her I loved her, not as a priest loves his parishioners, but as a man loves a woman. The silence in the small office stretched between them like a chasm. Frank stared at the priest, trying to process what he was hearing, trying to understand how this confession connected to his daughter's disappearance. "Elizabeth was horrified," Father Donnelly continued. "She pushed me away and looked at me like I was a stranger. She said she trusted me, that she'd come to me for spiritual guidance, and that I had violated that trust in the worst possible way." She was right, Frank. I had committed a terrible sin, not just against my vows, but against her, against you, against everyone who had trusted me with their spiritual welfare. "But what happened then? Where did she go?" "She ran. She said she couldn't go through with the wedding, not after what had happened. She said she couldn't marry Robert, knowing what she knew, feeling what she felt. She said she needed time to think, to pray, to figure out what to do. I begged her to reconsider, told her that my actions didn't have to affect her happiness with Robert, but she wasn't listening. She was crying and confused and angry." Frank's voice was hoarse when he spoke. "Did you see her leave? Did you follow her?" "I watched her drive away from my office window. She was driving fast, faster than was safe on those country roads. I wanted to go after her, to try to fix what I had broken, but I was paralyzed by shame and fear. I knelt in my office and prayed for hours, hoping she would come back, hoping she would find a way to forgive me and move forward with her life. But she never came back. No. And when the search began that afternoon, I couldn't bring myself to tell anyone about our conversation. I told myself it would only make things worse, that revealing what I had done would destroy my ministry and wouldn't help find Elizabeth. But the real truth is that I was a coward. I was more concerned with protecting myself than with helping find your daughter." Frank sat in stunned silence, absorbing the magnitude of what Father Donnelly was telling him. His daughter had been alive when she left the church that morning, but she'd been emotionally devastated and possibly not thinking clearly. The pregnancy, the stress of the wedding, and now the shock of her priest's inappropriate behavior had combined to create a perfect storm of circumstances that had driven her away from everything and everyone she'd ever known. "Do you think she had an accident?" Frank asked finally. "Maybe she was driving too fast, upset, not paying attention?" "I've wondered the same thing every day for 15 years. The state police searched all the roads between here and Indianapolis, but they found nothing. No skid marks, no evidence of a crash, no sign that she'd stopped anywhere along the way." Father Donnelly looked directly at Frank for the first time since beginning his confession. "But there's something else, something I discovered a few months after she disappeared." Frank waited, though he wasn't sure he could absorb any more revelations. "I was going through church records, trying to organize files for the annual audit, when I found something strange. Someone had made a donation to the church on the day after Elizabeth disappeared, a large donation in cash with no name attached. $5,000, which was more than most of our parishioners made in 6 months back then. You think it was connected to Elizabeth? I think someone helped her disappear. Someone who knew what had happened, who felt responsible in some way, or who wanted to help her start over somewhere else. The money was accompanied by a note that simply said, "For the girl who needed sanctuary." I kept the note, Frank. I've carried it with me every day since then, hoping someday I'd have the courage to tell someone about it. Father Donnelly reached into his desk drawer and pulled out a small envelope, yellowed with age. Inside was a piece of plain white paper with the words written in block letters that revealed nothing about the writer's identity. Frank studied the note carefully, but it provided no new insights into his daughter's fate. Who would have done that? Who would have helped her without telling anyone? I don't know, but I think Elizabeth may have contacted someone after she left the church, someone she trusted who agreed to help her disappear. Maybe she told them about the pregnancy, about what had happened with me, and they decided the best thing was to help her get far away from Millbrook and start over somewhere else. The two men sat together in the dimly lit office as the implications of Father Donnelly's confession settled between them. Outside, the sounds of evening in a small town drifted through the open windows. Children playing in distant yards, cars passing on Main Street, the normal rhythms of life in a community that had been forever changed by one young woman's disappearance. "Why are you telling me this now?" Frank asked. "Why after all these years?" Father Donnelly gestured to his thin frame and hollow cheeks. "I'm dying, Frank. The doctors say I have maybe 6 months left. I couldn't go to my grave carrying this secret, knowing that I had information that might help you understand what happened to Elizabeth. You deserve to know the truth, even if it doesn't bring her back. Do you think she's still alive? I pray that she is. I pray that she found peace somewhere, that she raised her child in safety and happiness, that she built a good life away from the pain I caused her. But I don't know, Frank. I've spent 15 years hoping and praying and wondering, but I don't know." Frank stood slowly, his aged joints protesting the movement. He looked down at the priest, who had just shattered and rebuilt his understanding of his daughter's disappearance. "I need time to think about this, Father. I need to decide what to do with what you've told me." "I understand. And Frank, I know my apology means nothing after all these years, but I am truly, deeply sorry. I loved Elizabeth, but my love was selfish and wrong. I should have protected her, should have been the spiritual guide she needed, and instead I drove her away from everything she held dear. I've spent every day since then trying to be worthy of the forgiveness I know I don't deserve." Frank nodded and walked slowly toward the door. As he reached for the handle, he turned back to face the dying priest. "Elizabeth was a good person, Father. Whatever happened to her, whatever mistakes you made, she was a good person who deserved better from all of us." "Yes," Father Donnelly whispered, "she was." The investigation into Elizabeth Hartwell's disappearance was quietly reopened following Frank's report to the county sheriff's office. Sheriff Bradley had long since retired, but the new sheriff, Maria Santos, approached the case with fresh determination, armed with Father Donnelly's confession and the mysterious donation that had been made to the church. However, after 15 years, the trail had grown cold beyond recovery. The cash donation could not be traced, the handwriting on the note provided no matches in available databases, and potential witnesses had scattered or died. Father Donnelly passed away 4 months later on a cold December morning, surrounded by parishioners who had come to love him despite never knowing the burden he'd carried for so long. His funeral was attended by hundreds of people whose lives he'd touched through his ministry, though the shadow of his final confession hung over the service. In his will, he left his personal savings to a fund established in Elizabeth's name to help young mothers in crisis, a gesture that some saw as appropriate penance and others viewed as insufficient atonement for his role in the tragedy. Frank Hartwell lived for another 2 years after learning the truth about his daughter's disappearance. Though his dementia continued to progress, those who cared for him said that he seemed more at peace in his final months, as if knowing something of what had happened to Elizabeth had lifted a weight he'd carried for too long. He died in his sleep in the house where Elizabeth had grown up, surrounded by the photographs and memories of a daughter who had vanished into mystery, but who lived on in the hearts of those who had loved her. The case of Elizabeth Hartwell remains officially unsolved, though Sheriff Santos and her investigators believe they understand the basic circumstances that led to her disappearance. A young woman, pregnant and overwhelmed by circumstances beyond her control, had been further traumatized by the inappropriate actions of a man she had trusted for spiritual guidance. In her emotional distress, she had likely contacted someone who helped her leave Indiana and start over somewhere else, possibly assuming a new identity and raising her child far from the community that had been her entire world. Over the years since Father Donnelly's confession became known to the authorities, there have been occasional reports of sightings that might have been Elizabeth, a woman working as a teacher in Oregon who bore a strong resemblance to her, another in Montana who had arrived in a small town pregnant and alone in 1993. But none of these leads have been confirmed, and the investigators acknowledge that after so many years, Elizabeth Hartwell may never be found, even if she is still alive. The story of Elizabeth's disappearance has become part of Millbrook's history, a reminder of how secrets and human failings can have consequences that ripple through generations. St. Matthew's Church continues to serve the community, now under the leadership of Father James Rodriguez, a young priest who has worked hard to rebuild trust and provide the kind of spiritual guidance that his predecessors should have offered. The scholarship fund established in Elizabeth's memory has helped dozens of young women pursue education and build better lives for themselves and their families. Robert Caldwell eventually married and had children of his own, though he never forgot his first love or stopped wondering what might have been if that June morning had unfolded differently. He still visits Elizabeth's memorial tree on the anniversary of her disappearance, now accompanied by his own family, who have learned to understand that some losses never fully heal, but can be honored through memory and continued love. The truth about Elizabeth Hartwell's disappearance serves as a complex reminder of how human beings are capable of both tremendous love and devastating failure, sometimes within the same moment. Father Donnelly's confession, while providing some answers to questions that had haunted Millbrook for 15 years, also raised new moral questions about forgiveness, redemption, and the price of keeping secrets that affect entire communities. Today, nearly 30 years after Elizabeth disappeared, her story continues to resonate with those who believe that everyone deserves the chance to start over, to escape from circumstances that have become unbearable, and to find peace in their own way. Whether she found that peace, whether she lived to raise her child and build the life she dreamed of, remains unknown. But in the end, perhaps the most important truth is that Elizabeth Hartwell was a young woman who faced an impossible situation with the courage to make difficult choices, even when those choices led her away from everything and everyone she'd ever known. Her disappearance serves as a testament to the mysterious ways in which ordinary lives can become extraordinary stories, and how even the smallest communities can harbor secrets that take decades to understand. The people of Millbrook continue to hope that somewhere Elizabeth found the sanctuary she was seeking, and that the love that drove her away ultimately led her to the peace and happiness she deserved.